All right, it's 6 o'clock, and I think we've got a quorum, especially with Mr. Morales joining us here today. So if you guys are ready, we can get started. All right, I think our first line of action would be just a roll call for attendance. Is Amy there? Would you mind doing that for us, Amy?
I sure can. All right, Commissioner Bandy, are you here?
I'm here.
All right, Commissioner Nordstrom,
Yep, here.
perfect. Commissioner Terrell,
Here.
Commissioner Fernandez Madrid,
Here.
perfect. Commissioner Graham,
Here.
perfect. And Planning Chair Stewart.
I'm here.
All right, that's everybody. And then we have a new member filling our vacancy, Mr. Gabe Morales. So Gabe, in order to serve, it's pretty simple. You raise your right hand and you read that section of the packet that says I, Gabe Morales, and that's all you gotta do.
Okie dokie. You guys ready?
We are.
Is okie dokie part of the thing? Didn't know that before.
Okay. I, Gabe Morales, the undersigned duly appointed planning commissioner for the city of Carlton, do hereby solemnly swear I will support the Constitution and laws of the United States of America and the state of Oregon and the charter and ordinances of the city of Carlton. And I will faithfully perform my duties as planning commissioner to the best of my ability.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Welcome
Welcome.
aboard, Gabe. We'll look forward to all of us meeting you in person here very, very soon. With that said, today is a work session. I presume that's for that reason we are going to defer the approval of our prior minutes for our next meeting that will be on May 9th. Is that correct, Amy?
That is correct.
Understood. At this point, I don't have anybody here. Is anybody there at City Hall requesting to make a citizen comment?
There is not, it's Bob and I.
All right, if somebody comes in, they'll be breaking the door down, waiting to tell us their peace of mind. But until then, we'll shift right on to our first discussion topics, which is subsequent to Mr. Jenkins' thoughtful and helpful memorandum about some possible implementations to our code, both in the immediate term and then considerations for our comprehensive plan update. Mr. Jenkins, give you the microphone.
All right. Thank you, sir. Amy, can I share my screen?
Sure, just 1 second.
Yeah, so I'll kind of start with a brief intro once I get my PowerPoint up. But I hope you've all had the time to read the memo, so you have some sort of idea of what we'll be discussing today. Broadly speaking, there are some issues with the city's code, as I'm sure you know, that we are looking at addressing through the consultant-led development code update. But because the development code update of that project isn't going to be probably for another, I think, year or so, maybe a little less than that. And we have had some interest from developers and in some properties where those code updates would apply, and the Planning Commission has expressed a little bit of concern that those code updates wouldn't be complete before that development occurred. We staff met with the developer and went over some options, the potential developer, and went through some options of stuff we've heard from the Planning Commission, just to kind of change up the type of housing that we're seeing specifically in the R2 zone. And this is meant to just kind of put forward some of those options, explain the deficiencies in the code, and see if the Planning Commission has interest in addressing those. And so I'm going to start again just by sharing my screen here. All right, so I put together a little bit of just a little presentation that discusses some of the items that were also in the memo. So specifically what we're looking at is attached housing, and we've had a few applications in the last few years, at least since I've been the planner for you guys, specifically with Brooklyn Terrace, the project off Roosevelt with Community Home Builders. I think there might be one other one that I'm missing where developers are expressing interest in attached housing, specifically in the city's R2 and R3 zones. And one of the problems with that development that we've seen is that if someone wants to submit a subdivision or a site development review application for that attached housing, so when we say attached housing, we're talking about townhomes or other row house type uses or type development, is that the city's code, while it allows it as a use, doesn't actually practically allow for developers to build in ways that make sense economically for them, which means that we don't really see these kind of developments in Carlton unless a bunch of variances are applied for, which is how we've moved forward with a few of the previous developments. So as that said, I'm going to go over a little bit of the background here, and I'm sure you've heard some of the buzz language with middle housing in Oregon, which was part of House Bill 2001, which is most famous for eliminating single-family zoning in the large cities, so the Portlands of the world, but also had some language in there talking about the need for middle housing. And middle housing applies to duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters, which are essentially individual units, apartment units clustered around a courtyard. So these are kind of viewed as really important aspects of bringing somewhat affordable housing to cities. And while it was targeted towards larger cities, a lot of smaller cities are also adopting it in order to clean up development codes. Haven't really allowed these types of housing to exist in cities up to now. Now, obviously, with smaller cities, there's some understandable concern about increasing the density too much. You want to obviously maintain the small town feel. You don't want to see a lot of apartments everywhere. For the most part, that's feedback that I typically get from planning commissioners. That's not necessarily saying that all you feel that way, but those are some common issues. So what we're seeing in Carlton's code specifically is that the development code, when it was implemented, so specifically the R2 zone, there weren't a lot of development standards meant specifically to address this type of housing. And as a result, there's not the development standards, the dimensional standards don't provide the leeway and the flexibility that incentivizes developers to pursue this type of housing. And what we get when we don't have those incentives is stuff like JR Meadows, where you just have large single family lot after large single family lot with a little bit of higher density apartments sprinkled in. And during that process, obviously, we heard a lot from both you guys and the city council about why aren't there duplexes? Why aren't there townhomes? Why aren't there some additional housing types that fit the R2 zone maybe a little more? Why are we just seeing these large lot single family? And put simply, it's because the development code doesn't offer the proper incentives for developers to think that type of housing is going to be viable for them from both the financial standpoint, but also a lot size and just general standards perspective. So a little bit of background on why we're bringing this to you. It's something that would have been brought up certainly at the code update and when that comes around as part of our project with 3J. But because we've had developers approach us and want to meet with us about ways that they can provide development that the Planning Commission is more enthusiastic about, we thought it would be useful to go over this now and maybe do kind of a minor code amendment now that would clean up some of the issues with the development code and able to kind of preempt an application coming in that the Planning Commission would not be able to review in the way that they would like should a code amendment come in later. So that's really the goal, is that we've met with developers. They've told us, we're okay with developing this kind of housing, but we don't think the code currently, provides those incentives. And from a planning perspective, I agree. And that's why we've seen a lot of the need for variances with some of these past projects for townhomes. So again, I'm just going to run through these. I'm sure you're pretty aware of these, but what are some of the benefits to attached housing? Affordability is one. Smaller lot size, smaller units are typically more affordable, not always, but typically. Gives us a diversity in housing types. So rather than just those large lot, single family, detached, minimum 7,000 to 8,000 square feet, typically what we're seeing in the newer subdivisions. You're going to see a mix of the two. Third, efficient land use pattern makes for a little bit higher density while still not, bringing in all these apartments and kind of higher density R3 type housing that block off certain residential areas and that people might complain about, which also reduces the need for additional encroachment into rural land via a UGB expansion or annexations into land that's currently within the UGB but zoned for farm uses. And then again, just that low to high density transition, rather than having either single family low or kind of large lot size single density, and then immediately transitioning straight up into that, 25 to 30 unit apartment buildings. You see a little bit of both. So you'll have some homes in the neighborhood that are, that detached, single family, what you see here on the image, or you'll see some duplex, triplex, courtyard style units and townhomes that you'll see in typically we see in R2 and R3 zones in a lot of these kind of smaller cities around the state. So those are the main benefits, and it really allows just some more flexibility and review. It allows some more standards to be applied in a more logical sense, and also allows a mixture in affordability. So just a brief overview of the R2 zone, and if you've looked at it at all, I'm sure you'll kind of looked at what I identified here as some of the problems. So the biggest issue is really that the R2 zone currently allows attached housing, including some of those middle housing types that I mentioned, including duplexes and townhomes. But the problem is that the dimensional standards that planning staff, so myself and whomever else is reviewing these projects, the current code doesn't actually really lend itself to this type of development. So what does that mean? Well, when you have townhomes typically are narrower. They have smaller yards, they have smaller lots, but the city standards in most cases, specifically in the R2, don't actually adjust to these standards to allow for that type of housing. So we're seeing larger than needed lot size, wider lot widths, maximum lot coverage is much higher than it should be. Setbacks are unreasonable. Width to depth ratios are too high. And then access spacing standards for driveways are also too high, because obviously you're going to have narrower lots for smaller homes. So the solution to that is really going through some of these code amendments that I've recommended, and evaluating what the Planning Commission wants to do. If the answer is nothing, nothing's going to happen. It's just we're going to see a lot more of that same single family housing. If the answer is this is something we're interested in, then staff would pursue a code amendment that would make some of these changes. And obviously the stuff that's been presented in your packet, both in that the PowerPoint I have here, in the memo, and then also in that what am I trying to say? Oh, the codes, the example codes that we put together in the spreadsheet are good examples for similar measurements. Now, we could say that's too low, we could say that's too high. This is just an idea of what we normally see in these types of zones that lend itself for this type of development. So before I move into the specifics of each of the recommended changes, I just wanted to kind of open it up and see if anyone had any specific questions about anything I just went over, any questions or concerns about anything that was said as part of that spiel.
I did have a question for you, Kyle.
More broadly, why we're having this discussion, if anyone's confused about why we're having the discussion.
I did have a brief question for you, Kyle, just about how often are you or city staff being approached by developers saying, this is really an element of the code that would allow us to come in and bring more affordable housing to the community?
So I think, Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, you might get some inquiries that I don't hear about, but really I think it's happened twice in the last month from the same interested party. But the main thing that we're seeing is that we've also had those 3 townhome developments that I mentioned at the start, that we had to really kind of massage the code in ways I wasn't entirely comfortable with, including, you know, variances and all of these things to allow them to develop these attached dwellings in the R2 zone. So it's a combination of both the interest that we're seeing, as well as some past projects that we've really had to kind of finesse the code in order to make work. And that's kind of what we're trying to avoid, instead of requiring 4 to 5 variances that really probably shouldn't be, you know, used as ways to make the mechanism function as intended. We want to make sure that there's actual stuff in the code that lends itself to this type of development, if that makes sense. And in this
Appreciate that.
specific case, we're talking about the property that was rezoned, and the developer who just back in the fall of last year, and the developer came to us and said, hey, we know there's been some concerns over housing types. What can we do to maybe mix up some of the housing options? And this was staff's recommendation for a possible way to move forward.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I see Commissioner Fernandez Madrid has a question as well.
I think I'm unmuted now. Just to dovetail onto Anthony's statements too, I want to preface that with a huge thank you to you, Kyle, for laying out that 6-page memorandum, giving so much detail, and even backing up further to City Manager Beauclair. It just, when we had originally met this particular group of commissioners, there was some urgency because the comprehensive plan was so far out of date. So just going back to that original call to jump on getting that updated, you know, this is moving all that forward. And so I'm very heartened actually to be having this discussion. So I just want to thank the appropriate parties, and even J.R. Meadows, if they're coming to you hat in hand saying, you know, let's massage this, let's bring things more into the line of what planning wants to see, then I'm heartened to hear that. I have a couple of concerns just going over the 6 pages that you had there, Kyle. One was the pretty reduced lot sizes.
Well, if you don't mind, we can go through each of these individually if you don't
Yeah.
mind. And then I know some of them, and this was something I thought, there's some of these standards are probably at the low end of what the Planning Commission is comfortable with, and that's totally understandable. But I kind of
Yeah.
want to go through, if we can go through each one of these and kind of
Absolutely.
explain why
Let's-
each of them is necessary, and then discuss kind of what we'd like to see in terms of actual numbers and
Yeah,
whether it's
let's-
small, too large, et cetera.
Let's go ahead and move that forward. Thank you, Kyle.
Does anyone have any other questions before I hop into the details?
No, sir. Please proceed.
All right, so the first one that we're looking at, and can you all still see the screen in PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
So the first one that we're looking at is minimum lot size, and this is really the biggest one. And the reason for this is because large lot sizes, obviously, just from a practical standpoint, if developers don't have the incentive to be able to build more units, they're going to build the units that can make them the most money in more times than not. So if we have large lot sizes that don't lend themselves to townhome development, we're just not going to see that townhome development. That's just kind of a practical fact of development. That's just something that we're not going to see if it's not incentivized in some way. So how do we incentivize that? We reduce the lot size. Now, again, these are the proposed lot sizes, and these are pretty standard for townhomes. I know 2,500 feet seems really small, and it is certainly smaller than what we have currently with the 5,000. But again, it's really about townhomes. What are we seeing? What's the difference between a townhome and a single family, lot? The yards aren't going to be as big. The side yards aren't going to be as big. They're attached to the neighboring property, to the neighboring home. So practically, it makes sense as well that the lot size would be reduced. Maybe not to 2,500, but certainly between 25 and 3,000 is what I would recommend. Just because, again, it's if we want to see some sort of housing, that's approximately about the lot size that I see interest in this kind of development around. anyone have any specific comments on lot size?
I know Annette does, and then we'll let some others speak.
Sure.
If you could, Kyle, refresh us on the one development with the 4 variances. So basically it was the cluster of homes. Some were shared, and obviously there was significant yard space in between. Can you give us an approximation per duplex, what that
Yeah,
lot
so-
was?
Yes, so I believe the interior lots for that property, and this is the difference between what we're looking at here and what we're looking at with that project, is that that project was an R3. And R3, as I think I put in the spreadsheet, but let me pull it up. Can you see the spreadsheet?
Yes,
So the spreadsheet, what we're looking at here, this R3 minimum lot size for interior lot is currently at 2,400. So because that development was in the R3, they were able to use those 2,400 foot interior lots and then 5,000 foot
Okay.
corner lots. So
okay,
essentially what my recommendation is that if we're going to allow this type of development, it's not really, the difference between R2 development and R3 development is really just the higher end of the density. If we're doing these kind of smaller end or lower end type of developments, I'm not sure why there should be a substantial difference in lot size for attached dwellings in particular, because it's the same type of development. It's not necessarily saying, we're going to build these huge apartments. It's the same type of
Right.
development. It's just the lot size that those developments are on. So
right,
they were able to do that. And that's been, I believe, the specific, and I think you're talking about the Brooklyn Terrace development.
Yeah.
And
and where
they were in R3.
Marcia Mycash was the architect on that?
Yes, I believe so.
So just to
So-
clarify, so each of the duplexes had 2,500 square feet. So for each duplex unit, it was 5,000 square feet?
So they
Like-
weren't duplexes, they were townhomes. So the difference between that is that duplexes are on one lot, townhomes are on 2 lots. So
Split,
um,
okay,
so they have the duplexes, they are, think of a house with 2 units inside of it, whereas
Right.
townhomes are their individual unit. Developers don't tend to like duplexes very much because they can't sell each lot separately and they require a separate service for utilities. So
Mhm.
that's why townhomes are typically more popular, and that actually typically goes for buyers or renters as well, as it's just a separate space. So that's why duplexes are typically more popular than attached, or excuse me, less popular than townhomes or something like that.
sorry about all the street noise here. All right, so then those lots were 2,500 per unit,
Yes,
correct?
and I think they were 2450 or something like that. And then I think that they, if I'm remembering properly, they had an approved variance for the corner lot size down to a similar level. a similar
Okay.
number.
Thank you.
and- Yeah.
I just
And
needed that.
Sure. And just to clarify why the corner lot size is larger, that's because corner lots, they obviously have two property lines on with street frontage. So the idea is to give that residence an appropriate setback on not just one side, but also the other side. With townhomes, some people argue that's not entirely necessary, but that's kind of the logic behind why
Okay.
why
I
those
just-
lot sizes and corner lots are bigger.
I just needed that to refresh my memory. And I think it had something to do with the turning radius into the driveways there too. So that just gives me a visual cue as to what the lot size was. Thank you, Kyle.
Yep.
I see Commissioner Terrell has her in the flesh hand raised.
Hey, Kyle, I'm a big fan of having higher density and townhomes and things. I just think it makes sense for saving our farmland, from having to move that urban growth boundary. My concern with it though is that we simultaneously with creating this code where they can decrease the lot sizes, that means we're going to have more impermeable surface and more stormwater runoff, which somehow we need to make sure that we have detention facilities or planting strips for our stormwater if we're going to make those lot sizes so much smaller and create those denser housing.
Sure. So yeah, so I mean, so this is just really the first step here. So this is kind of why we're having this work session, is to have, this isn't necessarily what's going to be put in the code. It's really a, is this what you want to see? Are there mitigating factors like what you just mentioned that need to be in place, or that you think need to be in place for specifics? There's things that can be added, there's things that can be removed. So I'll certainly take a note of that and
Yeah.
do a little bit of research on ways other cities might have mitigated
Right.
that.
And then also just making sure that there's connectivity so that the whole neighborhood has a gathering spot, like, the open space, the green space, it really is functional. That's not just, a lot that they couldn't bother to develop.
Right.
And then my final comment is, I just heard why duplexes were not preferred, but when JR Meadows was built, specifically one of the things that they brought before the planning commission, I wasn't on the planning commission then, but I remember them saying that they had deliberately created lots that were large enough to build duplexes on, but then they just didn't build duplexes on them. So I'm wondering if with this code, if we do these smaller lots, if they will try to put single family homes on these smaller lots. Like, how do we make sure it becomes a townhome and not?
So these single family, so these dwellings, and the R3 zone has currently, if you want to see kind of how it should look, the R3 zone is actually pretty well done already. I'm not sure why that is, but the lot sizes are specific to attached dwellings. So
Okay.
it would be written into the code that if you're going to be utilizing these reduced lot sizes, you have to be building this type of housing.
Perfect. Yeah, that's very encouraging. Thank you.
Yep.
Commissioner Fernandez Madrid, your digital hand is still raised. Is that residue of a prior inquiry? Looks like it is. All right. Does anybody else have any questions for Mr. Jenkins? Otherwise, we can proceed to his next slide or his next point.
And most of these are going to be very similar. So they're all related to the same kind of functionality of the code and the same purpose, which is to achieve some dimensional standards that lend themselves to this type of development and provide the incentives that are needed to encourage this kind of development from developers. So these are all very similar purposes, just different specific standards. And this is probably the biggest one in terms of why developers don't really have interest in townhomes in Carlton. And that's because the lot size, the minimum lot width is currently 50 feet, which is double any other code pretty much that allows this type of development, at least 20 to 30 feet greater than most other codes. And the reason for that, again, is just if you've ever seen a townhome, that townhomes are narrow. They're zero lot lines, so the setback requirements aren't as large. They're not. The yards aren't as big, so they don't require those setbacks that other single family residences do. So having a incredibly wide, relatively speaking, lot width requirement just doesn't encourage that type of development, because you're allowing the type, but you're still essentially saying we're going to ask you to build a more affordable unit on a similarly sized lot of similar width. So land use is a combination of all of these things. If one code, one standard is off, then it doesn't really make sense. So when we're kind of working with the development code in these amendments, we have to go through actually not just the lot size, but also what the setbacks look like, what the lot widths look like, and all of these items, and make sure that we're looking at how these developments are actually built in practice, versus how, in an ideal world, we could see these more affordable units or cheaper units, smaller units on the same size lots, but that's not really practically how it works. So this is, again, a similar to the R3, which is what I based a lot of these off of, as well as the comparable codes. Reduction of the interior minimum lot width to 25, and then the corner lot width to 40. So that's a pretty straightforward change. Again, this is similar to what we saw with that Brooklyn Terrace development, the variances that were submitted. reduced it down to this level for that development, which was approved.
Can I ask one more thing?
Sure.
So I should know the answer to this, but I don't, because I don't remember. When we decide, so say we make, is it the planning commission that says we want 50% of this space to be R2 and then the other 50% R3? Or is that the developer that proposes that? I can't remember. Which
So
one.
that's at the rezone stage. So they rezoned to R2 already. So the whole property is already zoned R2.
Okay.
And the reason why why we're proposing this and why the developer thought, pushed us to, or not pushed us, but asked us to bring this before you in a way is because essentially if they didn't have these code changes, there's no way the planning commission could force them to build this type of housing. So this allows them to build that type of housing while being within the confines of the code and also having kind of a reasonable incentive to do so. So that's kind of why both staff and the developer thought that this would be a good idea rather than waiting until, next January. I don't know exactly what the date is, but whenever the code update is scheduled to be completed,
Sure.
when they're already going to have wanted to submit a subdivision application. So back to the process, when they submit a subdivision application, they can propose lots in compliance with the code. And so if we're reviewing the code and the code has been amended to allow these smaller lots, then we can say, okay, this meets the criteria. If the code is not amended to allow this type of development in these shaped lots, then we have to pretty much go back to the applicant and say, no, you can't build these smaller, you can't subdivide in these smaller lots. The code doesn't allow it. You either have to submit, 4 to 5 variances to allow it to be done and provide that evidence, which isn't really what variances are meant to be used for. Or you can, build exclusively single family, and that's something that I know, we've heard concern about. So that's kind of the impetus.
But Kyle, they're not required to build these smaller lots. Am I right? Like they
No.
could decide, no, we just want to do single family homes. So
They could. They've, I didn't want to bring it before you just at this point, but they have provided staff with a preliminary plan of something that they're going to look at submitting that does include a significant amount of these lots for their next position.
That's good. That's encouraging. Thank you.
Something that might be helpful to know is in your various zones. So the development code for Carlton, when it describes the purpose for R2 and R3 zones, it provides a minimum or an average density that is kind of the goal for that zone. And so in this instance, for example, R2 zones are currently supposed to have an average density of 10 dwelling units per acre or less. Whereas R3 zone, I believe, is 12 or more, should be on the parcel itself, or 8 or more or something like that. So
If 8 to 32 is
8 to 32, there we go.
wide.
So in an R3 zone, you must have at least 8 dwellings, whereas in an R2 zone, you have a maximum of 10 dwellings. And so kind of in the way the code is currently written for your zones, there's an encouragement to use an R2 zone as a lower density than an R3 zone, just based on how you're like the averages you're supposed to be aiming at. If that gets changed around, for example, if it was you're seeking an average density of 10 dwelling units exactly, then you might see a proliferation of duplexes or various ways of creating more dense dwellings. But in the current way it's written, you can essentially take an R2 zone and just put a bunch of single family houses in it and split it up as though it were an R1 zone.
Right, because there's no minimum, right?
Correct.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you.
So, and the reason, and just to expand on that, that's a good point. And the reason why that is in there as a maximum is because, again, that they're trying to give cities the ability to make sure that they don't get more density than they're comfortable with, essentially.
Okay.
So that's something else we could look at, is putting a minimum density for a subdivision. That's certainly something that can be done. It would need comply with the comprehensive plan, so it would be a little it would be doing it a little bit backwards. But that's the idea is, again, the way it's written now is to have a cap, but that cap isn't enforced practically through where the standards are at. So those are a little out of whack as the code currently is written.
And the other thing and this is probably too soon to even bring this up, but as I recall, our city engineer said that we were, when we did the zone change to R2, he said that we were at the, almost like we were just like one house away from having not enough water. So, right? So with this increased density, is all of that also be considered and changed?
So they have to address anytime there's any subdivision, they need to address that.
Okay.
One of the criteria, and this is something that I think, we got in trouble a little bit with JR2, right, where it was approved with a condition rather than just denying. And I think from the way staff have approached this, and I've talked to Gordon about this, is that if there's not capacity, we're just going to tell the developer there's not capacity, and then it's not really worth submitting an application until we know there's capacity, because that's a criteria. And that's obviously up to the planning commission and the developer. If the developer wants to submit that application and the planning commission wants to approve it as a condition, that can be done. But it's more of just, making sure that any potential applicant or potential developer is aware that, we're up against that capacity point. And that's something that we go through during a pre-application meeting. So before an application is being submitted, Gordon will tell the applicant if there's any concerns with, regarding provision of utilities and code changes. All the code changes do from a dimensional standards is if there is capacity, this is what they could do. But that's a separate criterion that's already in the code.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. I appreciate it.
I see Commissioner Nordstrom has her little yellow hand raised.
I know that like when we've discussed a lot of these subdivisions, there has been an interest. I mean, that was the whole reason to do R2, was to have somewhat higher density housing. I worry a little bit about basically allowing R2 to effectively be R3 in certain circumstances. In that, like when we did the rezoning, if neighbors wanted to, be concerned about the rezoning around them, if they sort of thought, okay, well, this is R2, this isn't R3, and then suddenly a whole bunch of R3 building code type buildings go in. I worry a little bit about sort of retroactively changing R2 to having the same standards as R3.
Sure.
For certain kinds of dwellings. I get that
Sure.
these are
Absolutely.
for a specific kind of dwelling. So I think I want us to be sort of careful about that we're not suddenly, I mean, I think, you're living by a development that you expect to be a certain thing, and then suddenly it's able to meet a totally different kind of code. I do know that we have definitely, as you've said, expressed an interest in trying to have more high density housing. There, we do want R2 to encourage higher density housing, but, and I know we're going to talk more specifically about some of these exact numbers, but I just want us to be sort of cautious about effectively doing R3 numbers in R2 when people maybe haven't had a chance to understand what that might be going in around them.
Absolutely. So that's a great point. And I guess I'd have two things in response to that. Number one is that the standards that we're changing them so Nicholas, for instance, just mentioned the density range for R3, which is 8 to 32 units. Townhomes with these types of standards would be at the lower end of that R3 range. So around the 10 to 15 units per acre, which is pretty consistent with what we already see in R2. So really all we'd be changing is just allowing the units that are by code already allowed in a practical sense. So we're not allowing apartments. We're not allowing these kind of 20 unit per acre type buildings. We're not allowing, anything really above, if you want to do the math on, I think I might have had it in the memo, or I'm not sure if I did, but if you do the calculations on what 2,500 square foot lot size with the open space requirements actually amount to in terms of units per acre, it's not much higher than 10 to 15 units. So we're not really changing it to the same as R3. We're just doing we're allowing for a use that's already allowed in R2, in this case, attached dwellings, but making them actually feasible to develop. And the second part of that I would add is that this has to go through a public hearing. So if there's people that have, significant concerns about these changes, they have the opportunity to, comment to the planning commission and then comment to city council if they're really upset about it. And they have to obviously show that, there's some reason why that's not a practical or There's going to be significant problems in the city if this goes through, but they do have that opportunity, just like a zone change, to provide that comment at 2 different hearings.
That's good. And I mean, I appreciate the distinction between the actual density of housing
Yeah.
versus the lot size.
Mhm.
Because I do think the density of housing, how many families are living on a particular acre certainly affects things like water, traffic patterns, and things like that, probably more than anything else. So I definitely think if there's a distinction there,
Sure.
because I do think if city, if the planning commission is really interested in higher density housing, we certainly could be trying to rezone things, right? I mean, so I appreciate the distinction. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I guess the benefit to what they call middle housing, and the reason why it's become such a buzzword, is because it's essentially just more affordable, smaller lot, single family. So it's not, for the most part, what you consider multifamily housing. For instance, you had those two, the lot 38 and lot 71 developments in JR2 that caused a little bit of a fuss. Those would not be permitted under any of these code standards. That's not what we're allowing. It's all still pretty much single family. It's just giving the opportunity for potential for rental or potential for more starter home style.
Yeah, and I definitely think, we ought to be considering diversity of housing types. So I appreciate that this might encourage that.
All right. Anyone else have anything specific to lot width before I move on?
I see a magical little Bob hand up there on the big screen.
I've got a couple of comments. One is on 172210, the density right now is 10 per acre, right?
That's correct.
I'm suggesting that maybe the percentage you seem to be increasing in, rather than 50% before, it would be about 16 per acre. Also, I don't like going from 5,000 down to 25. I think you should be consistent and go from 5,000 to 3,000, because you went from 6 to 4,000. And the same thing with the minimum lot size. I think it should be like 30 feet and 40 feet, not 25. I think you're knocking, I don't think that we in this town need to go that drastic right now. And I think a 40% decrease in lot size is sufficient right now. I don't think you need to go 50% on this single lot. That's just my feeling, and that's it.
Sure. And again, these are based on kind of standards. And the reason why those are what was suggested was both a comparison to what the city already has and for the same type of housing in other zones, and also similar to what other cities have in their codes. And the main reason why it's at that level is just because of the reality of what developers look at in codes and the incentives we need to provide. That's what, I've been told, not just in Carlton, but in other cities I work with, is that there's a certain threshold to which, attached housing becomes practical. And that's essentially what that threshold is. Now, that's not to say that if you want to go a higher direction that we can't do that, but I just wanted to, be very clear about why that was what I recommended. And if we do go much higher, always, that's going to be more difficult to incentivize that type of housing. So I'm not sure exactly what that cutoff point would be where it wouldn't be practical anymore, but this is something that I've seen with other similar developments in other cities and in Carlton, frankly, that developers have been interested in, as well as kind of what's practical from this type of, what type of lot size is necessary for this unit. Now, obviously, again, understandable concerns if you don't want that amount of density, but the density already is there for that range for the most part. That's not to say that, it couldn't go up or couldn't go down, but that's where it is at the current time. So that's why that was recommended, but certainly understand the concerns there.
Can I ask one more thing?
Mhm.
This is one thing that I've noticed is, so once the urban growth boundary is filled, then we're required by law to create a new one to make it bigger. So it seems like it makes sense in order to keep our rural small town, it seems like we want to preserve as much of that farmland around us as we can. And if we are really smart about using our development space in a dense way that's also livable with pedestrian corridors and access to downtown amenities, then I think we can do a really good job of preserving our farmland in our rural setting. I think that's what it seems like. I don't know. You have more experience with that, Kyle. So maybe you'd like to comment about that.
Yeah, I mean, no, you're absolutely correct. When cities achieve their capacity at the urban growth boundary, then the state requires an expansion of that urban growth boundary, which then would go into farmland and take up that land for housing. So yes, one of the ways that you can help delay that or ensure that doesn't happen for the foreseeable future is to have higher density housing. That is absolutely kind of the intent, frankly, of the urban growth boundary, is to encourage that type. Now, again, small cities, understandable that you don't want to, not everybody would want to see those smaller lots. But again, I think it's important to recognize the difference between just smaller lot, single family, and big apartment complexes, because there's a really big difference in kind of community feel and what kind of impacts that has on, the feel of the neighborhood, just in my experience. And the difference in lot size is it's really more about the housing type than the actual size of the lot is what I found. But again, that's that people might have different opinions on that. So including on planning commission, city council, I've had that happen a lot of times where people have, slightly different perspectives on the best way to move forward with planning, and that's kind of why it's a discussion in the first place, I guess. But yes, I will say is that's certainly at the housing needs level. That's the first thing that the state would look at in terms of deciding whether the city's appropriately met its housing need.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Fernandez Madrid.
Just a quick question, Kyle, in these one or two discussions that the developer has approached you, have they submitted any kind of architectural or artist rendering as to the type of units, what these would look like to you?
They have, yep. And just for full clarity, they are willing to, if this is something the planning commission wants to do, they are willing to present at a second work session or at the planning commission hearing or whatever you would like, and have a discussion with you about, what would be something that the planning commission would want to see. For the first step, I think Shannon and Amy and I thought it might be best just to, ease you into this discussion rather than having them come, force what they want or try to force what they want down your throats. But, discussions with developers are very common. I think they're very useful and they're a useful tool, and, making so if that's something you're interested in, we can certainly.
I for one would certainly like a visual idea of what it is that they're thinking, because I think that helps in the decision-making process. I understand it wouldn't be a commitment on anybody's part that this would be the finished product, but being visual, I would opt for having some kind of template model. So
yep, absolutely. So we have those. I can either send them out or have Amy send them out after the meeting.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Commissioner Nordstrom.
I just want to say that I want to be careful, like renderings are nice, but as you noted, they're not a commitment. And once this is in the code, other developers may come in and want to use this. And so I just, I do agree that it would be nice to see what does it kind of look like. But I also think we do have examples around town already of what some of these things can look like. And I want to be careful that we aren't approving a certain kind or disapproving a certain kind. Like, we don't really like how that looks, so we're not going to allow this, or we like how that looks, so we're going to allow this, when the code should be sort of indifferent to what it looks like.
Yes. So one more thing on that. So there's two things. The city has pretty detailed design requirements for townhomes already. So when we review townhomes, we did this for the project at Brooklyn Terrace. There's a pretty extensive list of requirements they have to have. I would encourage you to peruse those and see if you think they're adequate. Obviously, we can't just say, no, we don't like how this looks, but the reason why those design requirements are in there is to allow the planning commission to have a little bit of, objective review of design requirements. So that's certainly something we can wrap into this if you don't feel those standards are enough, but I'd certainly encourage you to take a look at those existing design standards that we have for these types of dwellings and those types of homes. And we can look at whether those are sufficient or whether that's something we want to look at amending as well.
Before we proceed any further, Mr. Morales or Mr. Bandy, do you have any comments or thoughts you'd like to contribute at this time?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of listening and learning since this is my first meeting. A lot of the commissioners have already asked kind of what I'm thinking in my head as I've heard this. And I'm looking forward to seeing the updated comprehensive plan as well. From what I've read, it kind of seems like once that's updated too, that'll kind of help us see what the long-term vision of Carlton is, and what kind of housing, what kind of housing goes with that vision. So yeah, that's just a comment I have, but yeah.
Understood and appreciated. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bandy?
Nothing really to add to what's been said. I think we're heading down a positive road. I look forward to see the diagrams or the images that Annette was talking about. I think that would be helpful.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on to a few of these other ones. I'm not going to go into too much detail because, again, they're all pretty similar to what we're looking at. And there can be a little more discussion once we actually go through the amendments. Corner lot setback, again, this is just a function of where the space is. Just practically from a form standpoint, having 40 feet of required setbacks reduces the possible size of a unit. So larger setbacks, yes, they provide a greater, but they also reduce the size of a living unit for a potential family that's moving in. So that's why that's been reduced. Again, not something we have to do, but just something that is suggested and something that is present in some other codes. Maximum lot coverage, again, just the same idea. Smaller lots, reasonably sized units naturally make for less lot coverage. So this is, we've had some concerns about permeable surface, and that's certainly a concern that we can discuss as well. So this is just a recommendation. If you want to keep it at that 35 or keep it at 40 or 45 or whatever number you'd like to see, that's totally reasonable. But again, this is based off of some other codes that have similar provisions, and making something practical for a townhome that isn't in realistic, in a realistic scenario, going to have a huge backyard or something like that. Similar. Yep.
On the Roosevelt development there, I love it. They have the rain garden there to handle the stormwater. And so if we have those things in place, I feel like the smaller lots are reasonable.
Yeah.
As long as we're doing like a planting strip or a rain garden.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we mentioned that, I made sure to mention that point when we met with the developer about how that, there's going to be some interest in, definitely having that, if you're going to have that less pervious space, on the actual private property, how it's more useful to have those easements and drainage avenues in other areas. So they're aware of that. Again, that's something that we can look into the code, and Gordon's going to have the chance to review this as well if you choose to move forward with these amendments, and he might have some thoughts as well on ways to mitigate, an increase in impervious surface.
And the other excellent thing, the townhomes that are being built kind of by City Hall there, I can't remember the street name, sorry. But the sidewalks, because I had requested level sidewalks across the driveways, and they did a splendid job of that. So those kind of sidewalks with the apron around so that the cars have to do the bump up, not the pedestrians.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so that's really all I had in terms of specific standards. again, the in terms of process, this is really just the very first step. So this is just kind of presenting an idea of if the planning commission is interested in directing staff to move forward, whether you'd like to have a second work session or have me prepare and start working on some draft amendments for you. Or if you have any specific additional comments on any of these proposals or any specific thoughts. But this is really something that Shannon, Amy, and I discussed. And like I said, we met with the developer and we thought it might be useful to get this started rather than, the developers let us know that they're going to be submitting an application sometime, in the next 6 months or so. And they didn't want to, have a situation where the planning commission didn't want the type of housing that they were proposing. And this is going to, if we were to move forward with these type of amendments, that would allow the city a little more oversight on that sense. But again, it's a planning commission decision on whether you would like to move forward with these or not and to what scale.
Annette?
Just wanted to say, Kyle, too, since it's early to get our wish list in addition to a visual, it would be nice to ask for and treat preferentially some of the beautiful things that were incorporated into that. I believe it was the R3, but the drainage swales, the things out between the street and the sidewalk. I know when I did street and pedestrian safety, we were thinking about that back then. And these are all things that are very timely now. I know Portland's doing them. You've got to mitigate all that torrential water that we have in the Pacific Northwest. And it can be done in a way that's not only economic, but also beautifying to the neighborhood. So
Absolutely.
sort of
So
piggyback Commissioner
yeah,
Terrell.
so with the swales and that kind of thing, obviously there's required detention and drainage. So that's one way to achieve what's already required. I don't believe the city has specific standards that would require that if it's not, needed as some sort of other detention. It's required by Gordon or by an engineering requirement or a public works requirement. But we can certainly, encourage landscape strips and whatever's required, they're going to have to go with as well. So that's really just a matter of having that discussion and looking at the code and seeing if there's something in there that you think should be that would help address some of those concerns, and then we can certainly include that. Without going too far, we want to try to keep the scope relatively to just the R2 amendments, because we are going to, the consultant's going to be going through some of these other features, including drainage and street standards and all that kind of stuff once they get to that point. But if there are specific things that we want to look at, that's certainly something we can do.
Well, are not detention facilities now required?
They
I know
are,
our code doesn't call it, but the state.
Yeah,
the state
absolutely. So that's what I was saying, is that that detention is required. It's just kind of the specifics of how they do that, and that's swales are a way to do it. So
Got it. Okay.
it's really just the way they want to do the design on that. And
Yes.
if swales are a way to do that, then that's great. We obviously encourage that. I know Gordon encourages that. So yes, so that's a method for achieving that, and certainly for lots that have more lot coverage, that's certainly an easier way that they can do that as well.
Well, procedurally, what would be the next step? Is just to give you our go-ahead thing, saying we generally like what we're hearing, kind of put together a list of formalized proposed amendments. We vote and approve on it, and we send it up to the city council for their review and ultimate decision making. Is that correct?
Yes. So there's two ways we can go about it. So there has to be an initiation of a legislative amendment. So that can happen now. It can happen at a council meeting. I need to check, actually. Nicholas, do you know if that can be done by the planning commission, or is it a city council?
It's a type 4 action, which means that it has to be initiated by either the planning commission or the city council. So this is one of the areas where a private citizen can't bring an action to make this begin or to start this ball rolling. You have to do it, or the city council has to do that. In this case, what that basically means, so type 4 action is typically, you guys have been dealing with like type 2 actions is where you're doing planning commission public hearing. Type 4 is where you're either doing a change to your zoning codes, or the zoning map, your comprehensive plan, or your development code. And in this case, because you're changing development code, you have to go through a public hearing for the planning commission, which then, citizen comment and all that stuff. And then you provide a recommendation to the city council, and then they do a public hearing, and then they make a final say on it. So as a planning commission, whatever you come down to won't be a final decision that the city council either approves or denies. You will be purely advisory, but it's in your advisory capacity that you're able to kind of present to them good ideas and a great start for how to finish this or how to fix this problem.
And typically city councils trust their planning commission, not always, but usually. But yes, so that was a good overview of the process. There's two options as far as steps today. If you're comfortable with directing staff to prepare those amendments based on what you saw today, we can move directly to the hearing stage, which would be that first public hearing that Nicholas just mentioned. Or if you'd be more comfortable having one more discussion via work session, we can do that as well. It's really what you're comfortable with. A hearing, again, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback and comment and all that stuff. So it's practically not any different, except for the fact that at a work session, you wouldn't have to make a decision at that time, whereas a hearing, you would either have to continue the hearing or make a recommendation to city council. So those are the two options. Again, as I mentioned, I can certainly send you the materials that we have or request additional information from the developer and to give you an idea of what they're looking at doing. But as far as dimensional standards, this is really what we're looking at, what I presented today. As far as potential changes, again, the numbers can be different, but generally that's what we'd be looking at in terms of making this a viable and impactful code amendment. Because at the end of the day, the one thing that I do want to be cautious of is that if we amend the code that doesn't actually achieve any of the intended outcomes, then there's not really a point to amending the code. So that's the only thing that I would caution, but obviously it's up to you and the planning commission as a whole, how you want to proceed.
Commissioner Nordstrom.
If we're asking for some extra information, one of the things that I think would be a little helpful for me, you have the list of, sort of the comparison cities and their codes. I think I understand what all those numbers mean now. But it would be sort of helpful to me if there were a couple more cities on there that actually seemed a little more like Carlton, like Sheridan. I know what they look like as a city. And when I think about Wilsonville, Woodburn, and Sherwood, I'm not sure that's like what I think of as what we want to look like. So that kind of feels a little overwhelming to me.
Absolutely.
So if there are other, I don't know if maybe like Monmouth, there are other kind of smaller cities that aren't commuter cities. McMinnville's a good comparison because it's close by, or Newburgh, but they are still significantly bigger.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean we don't want to have things that look like them. It would be helpful to me to see what other similarly planned cities like Carlton look like.
Absolutely. And that's a totally fair point. I did my best and I will continue to look for more cities that are more comparable.
And also, maybe we're a front runner on it. That's totally fine too.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that frankly, there's not a lot of small cities that have had interest. And, given this is something you are interested in at some level, honestly, I commend you all for that, because I have had plenty of experience with planning commissions of smaller cities that I've worked with that have just said, absolutely not. This is not something we're going to do unless we are dragged to the.
And I'm okay with that, but I also don't want to feel like we're trying to be sure.
100%. And again, it's really about what you're comfortable with. As from my perspective, I'm trying to give the, what I think is reasonable and what will actually work. But at the end of the day, it's really up to you guys.
I really appreciate all your work on this and all the information you've given us. And I'm sorry to ask you for a little bit more, but
I know that's what we're here for, and that's what I'm here for. But if it would be helpful, I can also take some pictures or go around and maybe look at some similar developments and see if we can give like an actual what's on the ground version of what this kind of development would look like. That might give you a little bit of an idea rather than just having these abstract numbers thrown at you. So I can try to get some of that for you, as well as maybe some links to developments that are similar online as well. So, and obviously the mock-ups and the architecturals.
Commissioner Fernandez-Madrid.
ditto what Commissioner Nordstrom just said. I was a little taken aback when I saw Sherwood on there because it was like, we've said repeatedly, we don't want to look like Sherwood. I can throw a couple of comparables out at you, maybe Silverton, maybe Monmouth. They're comparable in size to Carlton, and I'm familiar with both towns, so those might be some good comparables. The other thing I was going to say was, in addition to those visuals and supplying those to us, I also want to ditto and agree with what Bob said. I think that a 1/3 reduction versus a half reduction would be something I'd be a bit more comfortable with. So I just want to agree with what Bob said in terms of lot size. And then maybe, I don't know if we make a motion at this point. I mean, basically, with all of the suggestions that we have submitted tonight, I would like to see with those materials coming to us, a second work session where maybe we can really refine this and then pass it on to council and or open it up to a public meeting. But that's just how I'm feeling right about now.
Sorry, I cut out there for a second. I think that was just me. I'm not sure if that was for everybody, but what I heard was a work session and or doing the planning commission. I'm not sure, but yes, that would be the way to proceed, is a motion one way or the other, depending on what you all are comfortable with. Again, just to restate, a work session be similar to today, and then you'd make a recommendation, or you direct myself to prepare the actual amendments, which would then go to a planning commission hearing. So that would be 2 more times you'd see it, and then city council, if you wanted to just direct me to prepare the amendments now, they would go to planning commission for 1 review and then to the city council, or depending if you wanted to continue that hearing, you could always do that as well. But it's really up to you if you want to have another work session or move it straight to hearing.
Co-chair Bob.
Well, I agree with you, Kyle, and I think that, but I'm concerned, and my concern maybe is that you almost made R2 R3. R3 right now is a 2,500 lot size, and we're going from 5,000 to 25. So you're almost in R3. I like R2 to be a little more of like if you have one large, which is 7,500 square feet per lot, then you're going down to 25 for the R2 and R3. I think that R3 should be a little higher. That was my suggestion, 3,000 rather than 25. And the same thing with the minimum lot width. Let's not cut it in half. Let's just do 40%. I'm saying 40% reductions in those size, and also we're increasing the amount of, just increase the density. I wouldn't go over 20. I would say more like under 20. Otherwise, R3 has a thing that goes from 8 to 32. I would say, well, I suggested 16, but I mean, I'm just saying,
So
let's not, I don't think that you need to, I do think that making R3 smaller lot sizes is very practical and really the future we should be doing, but I don't think we have to go down that far.
So again, I want to emphasize that this is the low end of R3. So we're not making it R3. Again, this is just, if we were to do the 2,500, I believe it's about 16 units an acre. So again, it's the lower, the minimum density it could be, or the maximum density it could be, would still be 16 units an acre. That's at the highest end if what was proposed here was approved. So the highest density allowed with these lot sizes would be about 16,000. I believe I did that math right. 16 or 17. I can get that information for you after this meeting as well. So again, it seems that way, but really we need to, it's more about the type of housing than the actual lot size in terms of what we're looking at with densities. So I think that can be a little confusing in terms of, oh, why are we reducing this so much? But really it's about the housing types, not so much the actual lot size. It's the housing types that limits density, not so much the lot size. But again, if that's something that you guys want to move forward with, that's totally acceptable. Just wanted to be clear that we're looking at that kind of housing, not apartments, not anything like that. And that's not with any open space requirement either considered.
Commissioner Terrell.
So if I can just add a little bit of perspective, having had a subdivision just built behind me. The lots, and it was R2, I believe JR Meadows, all of JR Meadows 1 is R2. And the houses are on whatever size lot they're on. But there is honestly, you could reach out outside one house and touch the wall of the other house. So when we think about, oh my gosh, we don't want these small lots with, no yard space, there's already no yard space. So when they build these houses on R2 the way it is, it's maximum coverage of a large house on the lot. And there's no garden space, honestly. And I don't know how to, I guess, my thought is a townhome that uses the space effectively for people who, my observation is people generally don't even go outside. I look up and down the houses behind me, and they're very large houses on lots that could fit a townhome. And I just think about how you could put a townhome on there. You could house people affordably. You could have some open space, and you'd have a lovely little neighborhood where people could actually go outside and be together in an open space. And you'd still have the same look, because those big houses on the lot that fill up the entire lot look very similar to a townhome on a smaller lot. I guess that's just my perspective. And I think it's worth thinking about maybe when you walk around JR Meadows to observe how those spaces are used when they're on larger lots.
Yeah, and I want to again emphasize that all these concerns Commissioner Graham had are completely understandable.
I
They're
agree.
they're very common, and I think it's really just a matter of thinking about it in terms of, I think seeing some examples would be very useful, maybe seeing some images, and then also understanding that this is doesn't mean that the entire R2 zone is just going to be townhomes. So that's not really what we're looking at. It's just kind of expanding the opportunity more you build these townhomes.
I also want to sort of come back a little bit to your comment that I think was really important too, Kyle, which is I think we don't know the answer to it. So I think we do need a little more time to think about it and maybe get examples, which is this idea that maybe we're more comfortable with saying, 3,000 rather than 2,500. But if that's not going to be anything that gets built, then maybe we've wasted our time, right? Like, I do want to kind of bring back that point,
Absolutely.
but I also think maybe we don't know. And
so that's a
examples
good point. And I could certainly look into that. And obviously everyone is wary of, no one wants to be held hostage by a developer, right? No one wants to be told what to do by a developer. And so it's really finding that balance of what works for the city while also providing the proper incentives for a developer. So that's kind of the nexus of what housing planning is meeting that supply and demand. So I think that's a great point. And I think I can certainly look into that information. I'll see.
And maybe seeing examples, like this is the difference between like a 3,000 square foot lot. This is the difference between maybe it's hardly any difference, but would, like Susie said, maybe it would still look the same, and maybe one incentivizes it, one doesn't. Or maybe they look really different. Maybe that difference in space really makes it not look like you could spit at your neighbor the same way.
So what I would say is that what you're probably looking at with that, without getting into it, and this might be a better discussion for when we get into the nitty gritty of it, but what you're really seeing when you look at lots are lot width, right? If you're walking down the street, you're not looking at the depth of the lot. And that's one of the reasons, one of the suggested amendments is to the 3-to-1 ratio between lot width and lot depth, which is kind of prohibitive in some ways. So if lot width is something that you want to keep at 30 and maybe have the reduced lot size in general, that's another way to look at it. It's just a matter of thinking about what you want to see in Carlton. And I totally understand you want to see some examples, and that's certainly something we can get for you.
And there are, I know, and maybe I need to clarify, we're mostly talking about developers being interested in townhomes rather than duplexes, right? Because
Yes.
There was a sense that duplexes weren't going to be useful. Or they're not going to be we're not going to be able to do enough to incentivize duplexes.
Yes,
Um,
and again, the reason for that is mostly because from both the supply and demand end, people want to either rent their own unit or own their own unit or lot, and developers want to either sell or rent units on their own lots as well. So that's
yeah, that totally makes sense. But I mean, there are a number of duplexes around Carlton. So like, that's kind of what I was thinking of for lot sizes and things like that. But
and duplexes are permitted. So if they wanted to build the duplex, or if they got interest in another area, maybe not from one of the, the larger size developers, they could certainly do that. It's certainly a permitted use. It's difficult to incentivize them past a certain point, given the kind of interest in them, I suppose.
yeah. So that would be sort of helpful to know too. Are we predominantly trying to incentivize townhomes, or predominantly trying to just mix of houses? Yeah.
Commissioner Fernandez Madrid.
Just one final comment, Kyle, because hopefully this makes it back to the developer. If you're looking at a lot width of 25 feet, I think the term is snout house. You're going to have a townhouse with a very narrow, entrance to a door and a garage door, because there's not going to be any street parking. People are going to have to pull into a garage, and that's going to be the facade of the house. And if you're just going to have snout houses with garage door, little door, garage door, little door, that's Sherwood. So
Absolutely. So one of the ways, again, without trying to get too deep into it, one of the ways that the current Carlton code addresses that concern, which obviously is certainly a very real concern, is by requiring a joint access easement for pods of townhomes, so that essentially narrower garages that aren't allowed to take up, I think it's more of 50% of the combined lot width, and then a shared access easement, so that you're not getting a different access point for every 25-foot lot. So essentially, you're only looking at one for every two. And then I guess the last thing that I did not mention is that we are not talking about row houses here. So we're not talking about an entire block with 0 lot lines. The current code and how this would be proposed under kind of how I've been thinking about it and kind of how it's presented here is that you're still limited to a maximum of 2 combined units. So on the other side of that 2 combined units, you'd still have a 7-foot or a 5-foot setback. So you're not going to see 20 townhomes lined up with each other. That's not what we're proposing, unless obviously that's something that you're interested in, but that's not the proposal here. We're looking at attached homes, a maximum of 2 together. So that's kind of an important point that I actually did not mention.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's comments today. I think at this point, I'd like to take just a little bit of a straw poll. I like the idea of putting this to staff, moving forward with the hearing process, understanding that they're going to incorporate our proposals here, and put forward what would be a first iteration. We start the hearing process and invite the public to give us some comments at the next meeting. In the event that we receive a resounding community involvement and need to take a little bit more time, we follow the suggestion that we continue over for another meeting.
So I do have a thought on that as well, is that we could have essentially a true workshop with the public, so that it's not a hearing, it's just a workshop, and open it up to the public and get comment that way. And that way you don't necessarily feel the pressure to make a decision on that day. So that's just an idea, but you're certainly free to move forward with the hearing as well. So just a thought.
Yeah. Mr. Bandy.
All right, yeah, I you just basically put into that my thoughts, because I don't want to think that we can't do something along these lines, but I really think we need to have a more complete picture. And I think adding the public to it without an actual hearing is a wonderful idea. And then if out of the public, we get the move that they're behind the whole thing, we could then move forward. I think it's better to take that half step than the full step and be tied into a decision which might not satisfy us or the developer or the public. So I think that, you know, a non-judicial, non-hearing environment would be a best way to go.
I would
Would you like to make a
strongly
motion for
support
that?
Commissioner Bandy.
Commissioner Bandy, would you like to make a motion for perhaps our June meeting to include a public workshop, or would we want to have this as a standalone, bring your popcorn event outside of our normal meeting?
Well, I think, you know, let's get a consensus on whether we should put it in with our meeting or make it different. I probably think it ought to be different, but I don't know what other people's constraints are, so.
Amy, what is on the May agenda? Remind me.
We have the conditional use permit. As of right now, that is it.
Would we be able to fit it into May sometime? Would that be doable?
With that meeting or a different day?
I think a different day would probably be best. But whatever works. I think that's,
May
yeah.
is kind of filling up with our evening meetings between council and then the tax meetings, and budget as well. So it might be tricky to find something, especially if it's a location. A Zoom meeting I might be able to find time for a Zoom meeting in May. But otherwise June looks a little bit more open for an in-person public type event.
sure. It's up, again, it's up to the planning commission. I don't know if necessarily this needs to be a full kind of charrette style thing, but it's really up to you guys as far as how you want to move forward with it.
Can I make a suggestion? Perhaps we each invite one person to come to the meeting and make comment, or if they don't want to make comment, invite someone else to come to the meeting, to our regular meeting. That's a thought.
So are you saying you'd want to have it on that same meeting day?
So I'm a little bit confused because I thought that Anthony suggested having staff move forward with making some proposals with some proposed amendments.
And I think that was resoundingly rebutted in favor of having a workshop in lieu of proceeding to a hearing as our next iteration. And I will defer on that front. So I think we just need to identify a date to hold a workshop. And I think giving the community the better part of 4 to 6 weeks of notice so that they can get their head around this and then provide us with some comments is good. And so I think that suggestion from Amy is well taken, that we're looking at perhaps the first 2 weeks of June. We have a meeting that is to be held on the 20th of June, a planning commission meeting. So perhaps the Monday preceding, would that work for the city, Amy, on the 13th?
I'll double check the calendar, but that seems.
We could also, we don't need to have necessarily like there could, we could move forward with that workshop and then, make sure the date works for, everyone as well. It doesn't necessarily need to be an official date decided on right now if we're not, it's a little up in the air.
I think it'd be beneficial while we're all here, as opposed to doing this by email, if we can set on a date.
I'll double check the calendar
see.
and pencil it in and let you guys know.
Okay. I see. Jim, you got your digital hand still up. Is that a residual hand?
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay. Commissioner Fernandez Madrid. Annette, you got your little hand up.
Sorry, my internet's glitching here, so hopefully you can hear me. I was just looking ahead at the calendar. I know we have one more in 2 weeks, and then we've got the comprehensive plan meeting, I think Wednesday, the 18th. And looking at those first 2 weeks of June, it'd be nice if we could have a public meeting, call it a work session. I like the idea of that happening so that the planning commission would have, I don't want to say the last word, but one opportunity to finesse into our recommendations to council the gleanings from the public. And I like Anthony's suggestion that that's 4 to 6 weeks, so that there's plenty of time. And hopefully Amy can arrive at a date somewhere sandwiched in between when the comprehensive plan comes up next and our additional planning commission meeting. So that would be my hope, that we have a work session with the public, finesse whatever suggestions and consensus comes from those meetings into the recommendations that Kyle and Nicholas would then package to send on
So-
to council.
So again, if we were to do a work session, it would come back before you again for a planning commission hearing. And the public would also have the opportunity to comment at said planning commission hearing. So it would be a work session, then another planning commission meeting, which would be a public hearing, properly noticed and the whole shebang. And then that would be the recommendation to city council.
All right. Amy, was there a timeframe that you need to confirm of the 13th of June, or is that something you can do here on the fly?
I can have it done by tomorrow. I don't have access to it right now.
Okay. For the remainder of the commissioners that are present, assuming that there is not the annual meeting of the Carlton Dance Association, does the 13th of June work for everybody for a work session starting at 6 p.m. on June 13, 2022?
What day, is that a Monday?
That's a Monday. That's the Monday preceding our June meeting. I'm seeing thumbs up. I'm not seeing any head shaking. So that looks to be a reasonable. Bob, that works for you?
Fine.
Excellent. I'll put that down here as our tentative date. And of course, if things don't work out with Amy, then perhaps we could look at the 6th, which is the preceding Monday. Does that work for everybody? So that we have a priority for the 13th?
Without checking my
for the
schedule
6th.
fully, the 6th might be better for me. I might have a hearing already on the 13th, but I will certainly get that to Amy tomorrow.
Okay, so it works for everybody, the 13th or the 6th, correct?
Yes.
All right, that gives a little bit of flexibility. Bob, was that a hand raise or a
Yes,
high five?
I'd like to have Jim Brady sit there, and make his motion, and have Dave second it. What motion do you normally make about this time, James?
Did I understand him correctly? It's a little echoey, but he wants me to make a motion. Is that what he said?
Yeah, want to make a motion that we adjourn. And I want.
Oh,
Dave to-
that's, oh, yes.
We got a little bit left. We got a little
There's
bit left.
something else going on.
Yep, we're gonna get there, Bob. I know you gotta get home some of that ice cream. So we'll set aside 6th and 13th. We'll wait to hear from Amy and she'll give us the go ahead. And with that beautiful segue by our co-chair, we'll shift on to commissioner comments. And I do know that we have 1 point from Susie, and I'll just proceed that with one other one, putting Bob on the hot spot again. On the 20th of July, I am going to be unavailable. So I was hoping I could prevail upon Mr. Co-Chair to be in my stead. Hopefully you guys have a ton of work and I get to miss a really difficult meeting. Bob, do you mind stepping in on July 20?
That's fine, because August I'm not gonna be here. So.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. Susie Terrell did have a request for a discussion point about tree maintenance requirements in the city of Carlton based upon her very thoughtful sleuthing of the code. And so we will give Susie the floor.
Hey, so I had a citizen comment the other day. They were so excited, as I am, to see the planting strips in JR2 where they're going to be planting trees. Those are a considerable investment for the developer is essentially investing in our future treescape. The citizen did comment though, they said, well, how are you going to guarantee that those trees stay there? And I said, well, I don't know, they belong to the city. They have to be maintained by the residents, which is true. But we don't appear to have an ordinance that prevents them from saying, I don't feel like raking leaves every fall, so I'm just going to cut this down. And then I don't have to prune it to keep it out of the sidewalk. So I am proposing that we think about some sort of an amendment to keep those trees standing as long as they're healthy. And if they become diseased or die of drought, that they get replaced by the homeowner who is responsible for their maintenance. Because it's an expense for the city to have to replace them. And I think we want to have a tree canopy for our treescape to shade sidewalks. So that's all.
Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I think it's a thoughtful, addition. I don't know whether this is something you want to, would think that it would be helpful for us to make as a recommendation to the council, or have an interim step and let staff take a kind of a holistic view of this, see if there's anything that's perhaps in the periphery that we're not touching on, and then revisit this as a formal agenda item, have one final discussion on it, make sure there's not any other, as my dad would say, nits and lice that we're not seeing, and then at that point, make a motion for a recommendation to the council.
That's what I would like.
I'm wondering if this is something that goes in like CCRs. Like, so for that development, that it goes in as a requirement that that if a tree comes down, it has to be replaced by the resident. But I don't know how that process works.
What's a CCR?
Those are like your
Covenant codes and restrictions.
Yeah.
Is that something that neighborhoods develop, or is that something in the city?
I think I don't know exactly, but I know that a lot of even if our neighborhoods don't have a neighborhood association, there are still CCRs that come with our houses. So for example, where I live, we don't have a neighborhood association, but like you can't have a goat. And that's actually in the CCRs, the neighborhood.
Right.
So my suggestion would be, because this is in the right of way, so technically they're not allowed to, cut down a tree within the city's public right of way. That doesn't constitute maintenance, but I think it's still a worthwhile concern. Maybe that should be, put in the municipal code.
That's what I would like to see.
I think that would probably be the easiest, and that way you don't need to go through a full development code amendment.
Okay.
Deal
Yeah.
with the hassle of that.
However, we can protect those trees, and if they become diseased, that they get replaced. That's what I would like to see.
Where was this at again?
So in JR2, in JR Meadows 2, there's a planting strip beside the sidewalk, between the curb and the sidewalk. And so those trees will be planted by the developer as required. And then it's the homeowner's responsibility to keep those from encroaching on the sidewalk, and also to keep them, I assume, to keep them watered so that they don't die of drought. Am I right, Kyle?
Yeah, so yes, essentially just when they have those trees, it's property owner maintenance. So it's a little bit of a gray area. They're required to maintain them, but there's not, I don't know if there's a definition. There might be a definition, but I don't believe there's a definition for exactly what is qualified under that. So that might be something to look into as well.
And
But
yeah, and so if they use their weed whacker and strip the bark around the bottom because they're cutting grass that's allowed to grow up there, then the tree dies. Then what happens?
it's the property owner's maintenance. I'm not, so I would, my guess is that they wouldn't be required to, that's a good question, actually. I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
And see, I can see that happening.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of what happens.
Sure.
And that's this, I mean,
Commissioner
I hadn't even, it was a citizen that told me about it. So I was like, oh, wait, yeah, that's true.
Commissioner Bandy?
Yeah, my read as to the way I think it can go and understanding CCRs as I do is as a condition, we need to find a way as a condition of approving a development, a developer's desire for a development, that the CCRs for the development include in them a specific address of what Susie's talking about and specific punishment of one form. It could be in dollars, putting a new tree in, if they do something that is not in it and doesn't adhere to that CCR. Does that make sense, Kyle?
Yeah, so my only concern with CCRs and why I kind of just would recommend putting in the municipal code under streets, sidewalks, planting strips in public places is that not every development has a CCR. There's plenty of public streets around, specifically in central Carlton, that I'm sure do not have CCRs.
I'm sure you're right, but I'm saying we put it as something they must do.
Sure, and that, but I just, in terms of where that's located, I think that would be best located in the municipal code under Title 12,
Okay.
which is maybe 12.04, which is construction,
Yes,
maintenance,
yeah.
and repair of sidewalks and planning.
It also means if say some houses get taken down, where in not a neighborhood, and then the houses are rebuilt and now they have to fit like the planting strip or something like that, it would be nicer if it's just already in the code.
That's what I would like to see.
Okay,
So do
And
I need
the-
to make a motion for, oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, and the beauty is then it applies equally to everybody, old, new, development, not development. Yeah.
right, I agree.
So do I need to make a motion? So something? So that,
You can, I think, make a motion for staff to give a once over on this, bring it back before us for an agenda item, and pursue this with due haste and vigor for amending our municipal code.
perfect. I
Is
do.
that in our jurisdiction, the municipal code?
So it's a city council. So the difference between here is that it doesn't have to go through you guys.
That's what I thought.
Final decision is city council. So
This is one
Why
where
don't
you would,
we recommend to the city, why don't we make a motion to recommend to the city council that they do so? That's what I'm thinking. I mean, it's like we're adding steps in here we don't need to do.
that's right.
that's the direction you're gonna want to take
That's
it.
exactly
is-
right.
So I'm going to make a motion right now, guys. I move that we refer, or we let the city council know that we would prefer to see a change in the municipal code that takes care of exactly what Susie was just talking about, which is making sure that the homeowner must keep up that tree, the tree in front of their house in our property, that they must replace it if it dies, et cetera, et cetera. Worded a little better than I just did, but I think we all understand what I'm saying.
I second the motion. That we recommend a city council to have staff create a municipal code that protects the lifetime of a tree. And if it dies, to replace it, or if it's diseased, to replace it, and to not allow homeowners to remove trees that are planted unless without permission from the city.
Okay, I'll
Aye.
second her
In the
motion.
right way. In the right way.
Having a
right.
motion and hearing a second, we will take a vote on it. All in favor, please say aye.
I,
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Passes unanimously. We will do so as both Susie and James have instructed us. And with
One more,
that,
Chair, one more quick question. Was there interest in having the developer attend the work session, or is that something you would prefer to not have happen?
Hmm.
I think if we have samples from them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think mostly what people wanted, I think, were sort of pictures and an understanding of what it looks like and what lot sizes mean. I think the potential advantage of the developer would be that, you know, if we're trying to decide between 3,000 and 2,500, but I don't want to be tied to what
Sure.
they say they want, because they're going to say they want the small lot. So it might be easier if we have their samples, if they're okay providing those to us.
Absolutely.
And also just to clarify, Kyle, this would be the work session that the public is invited to, correct?
Yes, so the public will be, they have by every property, so when we go to the planning commission hearing, there's a ballot measure called Measure 56 that requires the city to notify all property owners that would be affected, essentially.
Right,
Term
on the
is
per-
rezone, but essentially when when a zone change or a development code amendment could affect the value or in any direction, up or down, of someone's property, they're required to receive that notice. So the whole public, everybody who owns a residential property will be notified. the planning commission hearing, but for the work session, I think it's probably just going to be, posted on the website and whomever you all would like to invite.
I mean, the developer can come, this is public.
Sure.
But
It's more about if
I don't know
if
that we
you-
need a presentation from
Right.
them or anything.
Yes.
Right, I would prefer them not come because I think the chances of them monopolizing the discussion are great. And I think the purpose of inviting the public is to hear from them unfettered and unpressured. So I would disinvite the developer.
I don't know if you could do that.
Can I clarify? 'Cause typically, citizen comments, we're not allowed to comment on what they say. Am I correct on that? That's what I thought my understanding was. When they make a comment, a public comment, then we just have to sit quietly and say thank you. Is that not-
No, as long as it's, especially in a work session environment, it's a conversation. And in a public hearing, yes,
Cool.
when they submit a comment, the planning commission's role is to, typically the comment is meant to be in response to a development code criteria, which it isn't always.
Mhm.
But no, there is not a,
Oh, good. Okay.
no such requirement.
Okay, thank you.
In a
your
public
boxing
hearing,
gloves.
it's very regimented when you respond or when you listen essentially. And so but in a work session, it's completely no holds barred.
Okay. Okay.
And this is kind of the classic, I don't know, I think when people think of a public meeting, this is probably what they think of. It's just kind of a conversation and a kind of a, I don't know, what the planning commission can schedule it and structure it how you wish. And I can
Mhm.
certainly lead it if you'd like, but it's really more of a discussion and an opportunity for comments.
Yeah, no, I would look forward to their input and I'm sure there's going to be some great ideas that come of it that we can then, like I say, finesse into our response to the city council. So that's the spirit that I'm approaching it in.
Kyle, will you send your PowerPoint? Will you?
Absolutely.
send that
Yep.
to us, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. All the information in it was pretty much contained in the two other items, but I can certainly
Right.
send it.
Okay, thank you.
And
Mr.
I
Chairman,
believe
is
with,
there more business?
I believe we are primed and ready for your magic motion, sir.
Okay, Bob, you got it. Yeah, will make you happy. I move we adjourn.
Second,
Okay.
Okay.
Come on,
Hearing a
Gabe.
first and a second. I trust nobody is opposed. Looks like we're done for the week. Thank you all very much. We'll look forward to hearing from
night, all.
Amy in the next few days.
Bye.
And
Good
we'll
job,
see you all next month.
thank
Stay
you,
healthy.
Kyle. That was great today.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.